Welcome to Serve Nebraska's Budgeting Section 1, Part 2. Again, this Section 1 has so many components that we broke them into two pieces. This is Part 2, where we'll talk about operational cost other than salary and benefits. So looking at the individual cost elements that are here and looking at the line items, there's general cost to operate the program. All of these costs should be in line with carrying out the program goals and objectives. It's important that you take a comprehensive approach in looking at the cost to operate your program and balance that back with the documentation requirements to ensure that you meet all of the federal requirements for match as well as allowable cost. Again, note that federal share and grantee share have the same requirements for allowable costs. Most of the categories in the budget are self-explanatory. The structure of the budget breaks down cost items as they relate to member and staff for both training and travel. So that's another key in looking at. You want to make sure that your accounting system is aligned to separate staff travel and member travel, because you will have to report that separately every single month if this grant is funded. The same thing you'll see G1 and 2, staff training and member training. Another large category is other program operating costs. And again, that's going to differ from program to program. I always find it helpful to look at the Uniform Guidance Cost Principles, as they provide a list of comprehensive costs that could be allowable. It also includes the documentation requirements. So again, what you choose to put in other will vary from grantee to grantee. Note that I said in Section 1, Part 1, when we talked about personnel and fringe benefits, one item that always goes in other program operating costs is the National Service Criminal History checks. So beyond that, you really get to choose how much you put in others. And again, this might change from year to year as we talk about the escalating match requirement. You can always add additional costs that you have in your cost allocation plan to the other program operating cost as your match increases. So looking at the specific costs in the category, we're going to go piece by piece and looking at the specific requirements. Again, this should be supporting the program operations and the blueprint for carrying out the work outlined. Don't forget that these costs have to be reasonable, necessary, and looking at the uniform guidance and the terms and conditions. And it's critical when putting together your budget that you have this also the allocable piece. So in terms of if you have a shared cost such as rent, you only want to put the portion of costs that relate to the AmeriCorps program in this budget. And again, it's up to you to really prove that you have that allocable piece. So have these things in your mind. Is the cost allowable? Is the cost reasonable? Is it necessary to, and is it allocable to carry out your specific program goals and objectives? The answer of the questions, is it allowable and reasonable, will vary program by program, because each program does different activities, has different number of members, operates in different ways. So again, it really will depend on the individual program, but stressing looking at how these costs support your program operations is a critical piece in compliance. Again, I like to refer to a lot of requirements. So looking at what an allowable cost is, you want to look at the Uniform Guidance Section 2 CFR 200.403. To be allowable under a grant, all costs must be reasonable and necessary for the performance of the award, conform to the limitations, be consistent with your policies and procedures that apply uniformly across federal and non-federal programs. So again, you cannot have a policy that says staff can be reimbursed in the federal rate on the federal program and a lower rate on other programs. You have to choose things consistent across the organization. You also want to give consistent treatment to direct and indirect costs. Ensure that everything is performed in accordance with GAAP. You can't use any funds as matching to meet another federally funded program. And you also want to ensure that all your costs are properly documented. So really thinking about the documentation requirements when you're creating the budget will help you be more strategic. It will help you ensure that you have that necessary information. Again, some costs require more documentation than others. If you don't have the proper documentation, the cost could be disallowed. So again, keep those in mind as you're creating your budget. It will save you a lot of time later on. You also want to keep the requirements for match in the back of your mind as you're doing the budget. Again, looking at the uniform guidance requirements, you can find them in 2 CFR 200.306. It states that all match has specific requirements, and you must have to meet all of these requirements in order for the match to be allowable. Again, there's a few sessions specifically on match. We have 2. We have one general, and we have one about strategy and cash flow. And think about the requirements. Again, the uniform guidance requirements for federal funds and match are the same. You also want to think about match and think about the requirements. There's not extra benefit to putting more match. Really, you have an escalating match that you want to plan for in the future. Putting additional match in your grant application will increase your risk, and it will increase the documentation requirements as you execute the program. So again, you want to make sure that your match is verifiable from your grantee's records. You want to make sure that you're not using the contribution in any other federal award, that all of the costs are allowable under the cost principles. We just talked about those. They're not paid by another federal source unless you have permission to do so, that they're provided for in your approved budget. So again, your budget is a key to allowability. As we said, it will carry throughout your program and be a large piece of compliance. And you need to conform to all of the other uniform grant guidance, and that could be the prohibited costs, as we talked about previously. In terms of thinking about documentation, again, as you're putting together your budgets, there's 7 pieces necessary, and really the goal of this is to really think about what requirements are there as you're putting the cost together to ensure that you have them. So, are the costs consistent with generally sound business practices? Was the purchase made with arm's length bargaining? Again, is the price that you paid similar to market prices for comparable goods and services? Did you deviate from your standard policies and practice? Are there increases in cost justifiable, or could they be considered unallowable? Do you have documentation for all costs charged to the grant? And are all staff knowledgeable about the documentation requirements? Again, one of the key pieces is a lot of the individuals that purchase the item are frontline staff, our program staff. The fiscal staff are the ones that process the information and typically are more knowledgeable about the uniform guidance. So this is a great place where you can partner and ensure individuals are trained on the documentation requirements. One of the things that you'll find is, for example, food is not listed and a not allowable cost in the uniform guidance. However, training costs are allowable costs. So you might have a day-long training where you're orientating your members and preparing them for service. You might put on the agenda that you have a working lunch. The food that you're serving would be considered a training supply. And to properly document that, you would want to have the training agenda showing the time that you're spending with the members. You would want to have a sign-in sheet to ensure that you can demonstrate that the members are the ones consuming the food, as well as the receipt for the lunch that you purchased. Again, Thinking strategically and training staff on this documentation requirements will ensure that you have the proper documentation to support your budget. And thinking of these things while you're creating your narrative will make your compliance much stronger.